We heard earlier about the Grattan Institute report that just came out, but there was a Grattan Institute report that came out earlier last year, and it was talking about the myth of the markets in school education. And it was really saying that, one of the interesting things that it was very clear on was that competition between schools doesn't work. The idea of schools competing against each other, the idea of parental choice just doesn't work and doesn't work anywhere. And what it started to get into was to say, well, what is it about successful schools? And started to even do a kind of comparison of public schools and private schools to some extent. But for me, the conclusion that I thought was absolutely stand out from this report was about school autonomy. Was about saying, you can't just say be autonomous or have this level of autonomy if we lose the focus on learning. And that kind of sounds obvious, but sometimes, in the way that you might be working to put your partnerships together to make your partnerships work, there's a danger that in all that doing, then of course, that doing pushes us into that fast thinking on the surface, and there's a danger, the pitfall is, of course, that we might lose learning as that core objective. This is quoting directly from the report. They talked about how if you confuse autonomy and empowerment of schools and make them interchangeable and blur the lines between them, that's a mistake. Because what they're saying was it doesn't matter if you've got autonomy or not. That there's plenty of highly autonomous schools who've not been empowered by that autonomy for one reason or another. And the kind of bottom line for me that came out of that research or that report from the Grattan Institute was that it's what we do with the autonomy that counts. It's the way that we wield that autonomy. It's the way that we strategically take that on and say, this is what we're going to achieve with that autonomy within the broader direction and the broader framework of the system that we're working within, so that we're all going in the same direction, but we're finding that our route through that direction so that we are contributing in that collective action way. And it strikes me that really matters, that changing nature of the world stuff really has that impact on this autonomy and what we do with it and that complexity. And I know we've been talking about that for a while, the world's changing, we've got to change with that. But one of the things that really struck me was the guys from Cisco were in town recently in Adelaide. So the Australian head of education at Cisco was in Adelaide. And one of the things that I was interested in what they were talking about was the big push that they're having on the Internet of everything. And so the Internet not just of connecting people and not just connecting information, but the Internet that actually connects everything. And I look at it and go, the Internet of everything? What the bloody hell's that? We're doing all right. We've got the Internet. That's making life complicated enough. Do we need the Internet of everything? And of course, that was exactly what we were saying a generation ago. We're doing all right. How different can the Internet make things? And how different has the Internet made things? And so now we're talking about the Internet of everything. Just to illustrate the Internet of everything, let me just show you this quick clip. And I'm going to go.
The milk. Thanks. And let in the dog that jumped on the woman who brewed the coffee.
Brew coffee.
That woke the man who was late for work.
All right. I gotta go.
And drove the car
Driverless mode engaged.
that found the parking spot
Find parking space.
Parking space found.
that alerted the door that opened the control room.
Hey, Bob.
That secured the data, that directed the turbines, that powered the sprinklers, that watered the grass, that fed the cow, that made the milk, that went to the store, that reminded the man to buy the milk, that was poured by the girl who loved the cat, that drank the milk. The Internet of Everything is changing everything. Cisco, tomorrow starts here.
So, that's one of Cisco's first goals at introducing us to the Internet of Everything. And of course, it seems pretty naive at the moment. But you can see how this idea of connecting things to the Internet is going to require us to think in different ways. And they've started thinking about that. So they're talking about globally the Internet of Everything being worth right now $600 billion a year. And they're looking at Australia. In Australia, what they're seeing is that when they ask businesses about how are you going to, what are the things that are going to be important, and extracting value from the Internet of Everything. On the right-hand side there, they see that 22% of respondents are saying that the things are important. The things that we attach to the Internet of Everything are going to be important. The second most important factor were the processes that we use. And the first most important factor are the people. They're seeing the characteristics of the people being the thing that's actually going to make a difference as to whether Australia does or doesn't extract value from the Internet of Everything. And so it's an example of, the changing nature of the world and that uncertain future that our young people are going to be engaged in, that's here right now. And in fact, if you look down the list of countries that are set to benefit from or realize the greatest level of profits from the Internet of Everything, Australia's there pretty high up on the list, 5th on the list, looking at $35 billion right now, per year, right now, being available to be exploited in Australia. Those numbers might have to be revised a little bit because of where the NBN's going, but still, this is an impact in Australia for our students. And in this thinking about what's changing, again, what we're seeing is some people like Cisco saying, well, there's a shift that's required. And so they're reflecting that same shift that we were talking about, that Dirk Van Dam was talking about, from the industrial to the post-industrial. So that idea in the kind of industrial, that doing things faster, more, bigger, better. Bigger is better in the industrial. Doing more, getting more kids through, get certain limited metrics. But actually, in the shift to, in this case, the Internet of Everything, then better's just better. That it's not about the clout, that it's not about the access to information or knowing stuff or just having a lot of data and responding to the data. It's not just about, that they've talked about business intelligence or even connectivity, but it is about much bigger picture stuff. So things like big judgment, things like exactly reflected by Dirk Van Dam's slide, that idea that intelligence at the point of decision. And I think this last point about the shift from connectivity to connectedness is a really interesting one. Because what they're getting to there is, it's not your level of connectivity that counts. It's your connectedness. It's the quality of those connections. It's the way that you use those connections. It's the strategic intent that you bring to those connections that makes a difference. And even if you look at that, that connectivity from a technology and education standpoint, one of the things that we see from some of those big meta-analyses about the use of technology in education is that technology in education has an impact of an effect size of round about 0. The level of connectivity doesn't make any difference. It's what you do with it that counts. And when you use technology, of course, in sophisticated ways, when you use technology to serve pedagogy, when you use technology to do things differently and to do new things, when you use technology to give kids a presence in a completely different environment or give that environment a presence in the classroom, that's the connectedness, that's the quality. And then you get really big effect sizes. But trying to get computers, programs, one-size-fits-all systems where the kids can do online, be taught online by the computer, that not only has an effect size of 0, almost always, that often has a negative effect size. And so the way that we use that technology and that connectivity counts, and the way that Cisco talk about that is the connectedness. And so in education, I'm seeing that same thing being reflected here, that there's that kind of industrial model over on that left-hand side and the knowledge economy model of education being reflected on the right-hand side. These are big picture strategic employment thinkers thinking along the same lines as we're thinking in South Australia about where education's going and how we're going to get there. I wanted to share with you some data from some of the research, from the educational leadership research. And I'm really struck by this data from John Zappia. In John's work, what he's done is he's looked at successful education leaders and less successful education leaders and say, okay, well, what's the difference between them? And so when we're working in these complex and ambiguous and chaotic environments, what is it that makes a difference? And what he's identified, of course, is that it's educators who think more strategically. So educators who are using those stop and think skills, educators who are not getting trapped in that fast thinking, but are doing the stop and think and getting below the surface and responding in much more of that knowledge economy way. And so, quoting from this research, what he finds is that in these chaotic and complex environments, the leaders who fail, the leaders who are not so successful, what you find is that they have what he calls these linear thinking mindsets that just don't work when things get complex. And so, for me, he's really talking about fast thinking. He's really talking about there's a way of doing this. And either we get told or we get pushed on us a way of working. That is a fast thinking way of working. And by just going with that one way, by not being responsive, by not being strategic, of course, those leaders are not so successful. He talks about how less successful leaders have a concept of change that's linear. And this idea that they overuse quantifiable parameters. And I think that's interesting as well because, again, I'm seeing fast thinking in that the kind of quantifiable parameters that we don't necessarily interpret them in sophisticated ways. There's in the NAPLAN data, there's a lot of richness in the NAPLAN data, but it's not necessarily in how it's reported back to us directly. We might have to stop and think about it and go underneath it. In all of the different levels of data that we've got, all the different ways we've got that we get data pushed at us, it's often either pretty raw and uninterpreted, or it's interpreted in one way, and there may be other ways that we need to think about that data. And I'm thinking now about that Cisco transition from that access to information and data and having big data sets and shifting over to having big judgments. So in our partnerships, how are we going to interpret this data? We're all as a system, in the state as a system, going in the same direction. We're all working towards this strategic intent. But how do I make my judgment work at a local level? He goes on to talk about how unsuccessful leaders don't make the connections for in their community. Don't make the connections between people, don't make the connections with the people that they're working from. And that really strikes me as important because of, again, what Cisco was saying about this shift from connectivity to connectedness. It's not enough just to have the connections. We've got to build the connectedness. We've got to bring the community with us. We've got to bring the teachers. We've got to bring the kids with us. And that idea about the empowerment as well, that self-management isn't enough, or having that autonomy isn't enough. It's the empowerment that really matters, making it work for us. And you can only get that empowerment, Zappia is suggesting, through working together and being collaborative and escaping from, again, that fast thinking. And I think this is the last point that I just wanted to make from this particular body of research about Zappia has identified that educators who are less successful use this limited set of actions, as he calls it, and this kind of one-dimensional set of leader actions. So again, what I think we're seeing is this fast thinking, there's a way of doing it, and this is the way that I'm going to do it, rather than a more kind of responsive set of multi-dimensional set of leader actions. And I'm going to come back to that in a little while. That Cisco, I keep coming back to that Cisco slide and that shift from bigger being better, knowing things being better, but to a shift where we put expertise and value that expertise, where we're really valuing big judgment out there in the schools, I'm seeing it, and in our partnerships, so that better is actually better. And so for me, when I read this research, what I'm seeing is, again and again, there's this kind of common characteristic of less successful educational leaders, that they're doing this kind of fast industrial thinking that works in an industrial context, that might work in that kind of, over on that left-hand side of Dirk Van Down's slides, where we've got this industrial model of education. But now as we're shifting to a much more post-industrial or knowledge economy model of education, this thinking lets us down. As soon as things start to get more complex, of course, there is a way of doing things, just lets us down, because there might be a common strategic outcome, but the way of doing it might be different. And as I'm reading this, I'm also thinking about the work that I'm doing with UNESCO, that it looks on the surface, that thing that I was falling for, that on the surface it looks like we're all pulling in different directions because of the sheep and the industry and the this and that. But actually, we actually are all pulling together once we stop doing the fast thinking. We've got this common cause that we're all working together to collaboratively. And in that research, in that work, we're also starting to see that there's a whole host of things that push leaders into fast thinking. And one of them is the paradoxes that we face. One of the characteristics is the paradoxes that we face. So we've got this problem with constant change, but looking for some stability, some rocks on which we can build our structures and the way that we're going to work. So it seems like change and stability are an either or. We've got this kind of linear processes, there's a way of looking at the Australian curriculum in a very linear way, especially if you look at the content. So what we're going to do is we're going to support our staff to work through, starting here, this, and this. Or there's a non-linear way of looking at it, to think about how things like the Australian curriculum, the early years learning framework in particular, create this non-linearity, where we can have this intent. If you look at the way that the early years learning framework set out, where it talks about these are the outcomes, these are the actions that we'd expect to see in the kids if they are demonstrating those outcomes, if they are developing towards those outcomes, and these are the actions that we'd expect to see in the teachers if their actions are developing these characteristics in the kids towards these big outcomes. But it's very non-linear. It doesn't say, do this first, and then this, and then this, and then this. There's a lot to kind of bear in mind while we're trying to think about the development of our kids, including where our kids are coming from, who they are, how they've developed, where they are today, and responding to that. One of the things that came up very clearly from, again, that the UNESCO research was this issue about the seeming paradox between localism and globalism. So, my mate from Kazakhstan was really struggling with that because his localism was his sheep. And that was a real skills need for those kids in that community. But the globalism was the transversal skills. And he could see that. And the danger is that we kind of flip to an either or in all of these things. And where I think we've started to come to, and I think this is, again, a kind of global change, a global phenomenon, is that we're not thinking about these things as paradoxes anymore. We can't think about them as being paradoxes, because by thinking about them as paradoxes, we get pushed into one camp or another. There's one way of doing it, fast thinking. There's the thinking about it as change or thinking about it as stability, thinking about it as local or thinking about it as global. And now what we're saying is, actually, our kids have got to be able to operate across that spectrum. They've got to be able to operate effectively across that spectrum, from where there's lots of change going on to where things are stable for a while. They've got to be able to operate from where things need to be done in a linear way to where things can be done in a non-linear way. And they've got to be able to operate from a local perspective and a global perspective, and in between, on that appropriate point in the scale. And of course, that doesn't just apply to the kids, that applies to us as well. So when we're thinking about the way that we're moving forward, when we're thinking about our strategic intent, we can't do so it's changed, so I'll think about it in this way. We've got to be much more flexible than that. We can't do that fast thinking, we can't fall for that. And in fact, one of the kind of models of leadership, one of the industrial models of leadership, has been about picking a position, that somebody tells us which position that we're in, whether it's change or stability, or whether we're going for localism or we're going for globalism. And I love this quote from Bill George, who's a professor of management practice at Harvard University, where he said, can we not just agree that the great man is dead? And what he's talking about is that idea of, especially in history, we have the great man of history. Often we don't talk about the great woman of history or the great women of history, because for a whole host of historical reasons. But those great men that people often refer to, instead of thinking about history necessarily as processes and actions, it's about how those processes and actions revolved around people, like Jesus or Muhammad or Attila the Hun. The women are few and far between, so we might put people like Elizabeth I or Margaret Thatcher or somebody in there. But the idea that the direction in which communities, countries, people, continents went was driven by a great man or a great woman. That's come over into our view of leadership as the heroic leader. You know, the person who takes it all on themselves, the person who decides where we are in some of those scales, those spectra from things like change to stability, and then tells us. And that heroic leader might be a heroic leader, a political leader, it might be a administrative leader or a leader within an organization, and it might be a leader within now, if you think about our partnerships and our schools. You know, those heroic leaders within our schools who take it all on themselves, who, you know, and I can see myself doing it, that sometimes it seems just, it's easier if I just do it myself. You know, I'll just take it on myself, and I get weighed down by all this doing of things instead of supporting the people around me to build their capacity to take these things on. And of course, the heroic leader could be really effective in that industrial model where it was about bureaucratic control. So as a heroic leader in that bureaucratic control, now I've got a place. You know, I'm going to direct what's going on. If it's vertical accountability, then the heroic leader sits at the top of that scale and directs down. But of course, in the shift to the post-industrial, then that heroic leader really starts to lose their way. If you think about it in terms of those things that Cisco were talking about, you know, I'm thinking about the heroic leader there linked with that idea of clout. You know, that it's about the force of my character driving, you know, what goes on in my organization because of the clout that I wield. And now, that doesn't seem like it's going to work so much if I'm talking about putting the expertise out there at the point of decision, about making sure that there's big judgments going on at different levels within my organization. And so for school leaders, in fact, for any of us, you know, as this idea of the heroic leader starts to then mesh, I think, with this idea of this balance between autonomy and empowerment, that they don't necessarily come together. That you can be given all the empowerment that the system can give you as a school leader, but that doesn't turn into empowerment automatically. We've got to make it work for us. So the system makes it work for us. We're working within the system. We're responding to this strategic intent and this shared direction. But we're making sure that we take that autonomy and turn it into empowerment. And we can't do it with heroic leadership. It won't work. And people like Professor George are saying to us, it's over. You know, that idea of heroic leadership is over. The great man or the great woman is dead. Let's get past it. And I think he's expressing a bit of kind of frustration there, that we can't get past it, that it's still something that holds on, because of course for many of us, you know, me included, I hear myself talking now and kind of challenging myself about my way of leading in some ways, that I've got to get past it. It's part of my identity to be the heroic leader in my team, and I've got to get myself past that. I've got to stop this fast thinking that I've got to take it all on. It'll just be quicker and easier this way, and go to building capacity within my organization. So, for me, whatever way we look at it, if we look at the evidence, we look at the research, we look at some of the trends from people like Cisco and those sorts of things, what we're starting to see is that heroic model of leadership is no longer sufficient for us. And again, back to Zappia's research, what he did was he went and looked at leaders and said, well, it's okay to talk about ineffective leaders, but what do effective leaders look like? What do effective school leaders look like? And this is some research that was published in 2012, where he looked at educational leaders in Hong Kong. So educational leaders who are successful within a successful system. And he said, so what are those characteristics of those leaders? Just let me pick out some of the characteristics first before we unpack the data. The first thing that he looked at was systems thinking. So leaders' ability to, think big, see the whole system, look at the independencies, not see things in a linear way, but to see those interrelationships and patterns, to start to understand how the forces pressing on school systems might push us in unexpected directions. He also looked as a characteristic of leaders, this idea of reflection. And the way that he defined that was about this kind of rational thinking, this ability to make judgments. So, the stop and think stuff that I'm talking about. And I think, interestingly, this point about creating principles that guide future actions. Not creating rules that drive future actions, but creating principles within the schools that are going to guide our actions. And the third one that he talked about was this ability to reframe. So to switch attention from multiple perspectives, to see it from this perspective, to see it from that perspective, to generate new ways of looking at this problem, and to see lots of different options for action. So we've got these principles that are guiding from us. What are the options for action that those principles create? And I think it's fascinating that when he did this, and he used a survey item to find out to what extent do different school leaders show these leadership characteristics. What he found was that at a coordinator level, or the equivalent of a coordinator level in green there at the front, that coordinators need a good spread, or that successful coordinators within this successful system had a good spread of systems thinking, reflection, and reframing. That deputies within schools had that same good spread, but in the Hong Kong system at least, the deputies and the people at that sort of level, they were particularly strong on that reframing, of seeing different options for action. So once the principles were in place, and you can see from the reflection that they were responsible for putting those principles in place. But once the principles were in place, the deputies were really good. What stood out about the deputies compared to the coordinators, the deputies were really good at finding alternative actions, alternative ways of doing this to achieve that common end. But look at the principles. What we saw at the principal level was, not only was there a good spread of all three of these leadership actions, leadership characteristics amongst the principals, it was higher than everybody else in the system. And the thing that really made the difference between the successful principals within this successful system was the systems thinking. The things that separated the principals from the coordinators and the deputies was this systems thinking, was this being able to see the complexity, was being able to respond to those unpredictable forces, was that ability to see the interrelationships and respond to those interrelationships. I think then the researchers went and had a bit of a cop-out because what they then asked the question, they said, so if principals have got these strategic thinking skills, in particular this systems thinking, do they get to those higher levels of responsibility because they've got those skills, or because when they're in those positions demand the development of those skills? And what the researchers said was, they assume that it's both. Now, I think there's a bit of a cop-out in this, because I don't think they actually know, and so they've just assumed, oh yeah, it's a bit of this and a bit of that. So I think they actually copped out when they put this research together. But I think if you look at other research, what you see is that these skills are definitely developable. So of course, when we first enter, a coordination position or a deputy position or a principal's position, the pressure on us in those new positions can force us quite quickly into fast thinking, can force us quite quickly away from the systems thinking and reflection and the reframing. But the more that our environment demands of us more and more systems thinking, then we get better and better at it. And I think that the research, lots of the cognitive science research shows us that to a large extent, when our environment demands the development of certain cognitive skills and capacities, we often do respond to that by developing those skills and capacities. And I think what we're seeing now is that in this shift that we're talking about around the world, this shift from that industrial to post-industrial, that there's going to be even more demand upon us to think in these ways, or there's lots of other ways of cutting the literature, lots of other ways of cutting the research and the way that we think about leadership. But in now, what we're starting to see is that leadership balance is such that the principles are demanded to do more and more systems thinking. I suspect in the future we'll see more demand of all of these three things on the deputies and the coordinators as well. I wanted to go back for a second though and to say, okay, that's all okay, and it's kind of big picture stuff. But what's the kind of action difference? What's the kind of judgment difference that we're talking about that makes for principles and that makes for the way in which we make decisions? And I wanted to come back to this point about big data and big judgment. And I wanted to show you some research that I think is absolutely fascinating that's just come out in the last year or so. This was some research that came out of Yale Law School. And what they did was they presented people with data. So big data. In fact, it wasn't that big, it was just this table. And they said, okay, so here's a table, and what's gone on here is that we've got a cream, a rash cream, and we're testing it out. And we've got some people who did use the rash cream, and then we've got a group of people who didn't use the rash cream. And the data here is showing us the people who, for whom the rash got better, and for people for whom the rash got worse. And the question that they asked people was, does the cream work? Would you recommend that somebody use the rash cream? What do you think? Go on, I'll give you a minute. You can talk. What do you think? Okay, I'm not going to give you a minute. I'm going to give you that long. Because, of course, what I'm trying to do is force you into a bit of fast thinking. Because fast thinking will drive you to think, when they ask the cohort of people that they asked, fast thinking drove lots of people to think something different to what happened when they stopped and thought about the data. So, if you do the fast thinking, let me just go back a step. If you do the fast thinking, it might look like, with that big number, that 223, on the surface of it, it might look like, yeah, so people who use the skin cream, a lot of them, the rash got better. So, yeah, on balance, I'd use that. For the people who didn't use the skin cream, there wasn't so many of them for who the rash got better. So the skin cream can't be working. So, yeah, the skin cream works. I think the skin cream works. But when you go below the surface and you do some stop and think, you do some calculations, there's 223 people who did use the cream and the rash got better. And that was 223 out of a total of 298. So the 223 plus 75. That's 298. So the percentage of people who did use the rash cream, 75% of them got better. If we do the same calculation for the people who didn't use the rash cream, 107 of them got better, but there was a total of 128 people. And so the percentage of people that got better, there was 83% of them got better. So actually, the people who didn't use the rash cream were more likely for their rash to get better than the people who did use the rash cream. So when you get underneath it and you start to analyze it, you start to stop and think about it, you wouldn't use the rash cream. You would, I don't think, my view would be, you wouldn't recommend to people that they want to use the rash cream because it's not effective. So, we're talking about rash cream. And what they found was that 40% of the US adults that they tested, could get to this point. 60% of the US adults that they tested never got to this point because they stopped. They didn't go into the stop and think. They had a quick look and fast thinking, and they stopped. 40% of them could get to this point. And they call those the kind of numerate cohort. Just to make sure there wasn't a bias, what they also did was they flipped the data around. So they kept everything the same, the story the same, but they flipped the data around, and what they saw was exactly the same thing, that people would rush to thinking that the rash cream was ineffective if they swapped the data around, but in fact it would turn out the rash cream was effective. Okay, so that's mildly interesting. But when it got really interesting was when they kept the data the same and changed the story. So when they changed the story, exactly the same data, but they changed the story and said, okay, so there were some towns that banned handguns in an effort to have an impact on crime. And there were some towns that didn't ban handguns. Here's the data from that, exactly the same data. What do you think? And this was where it really got interesting, because It was exactly the same as before. And you'd expect to say exactly the same as before. And you kind of did. So the kind of non-numerate cohort, the cohort that they tested for the level of numeracy, just did the surface fast thinking and came up with the obvious response. But the numerate cohort split into two, almost down the middle. Because what happened was, when it seemed like when the fast thinking made it seem like a gun ban led to an increase in crime. So if they did it one way, so that on the surface it made it look like this gun ban actually led to an increase in crime, what you found was that the people on the right side of politics who already thought that gun bans don't work, even if they were in that numerate cohort, they got it wrong because they fell for it, because they stopped thinking. And the people on the other side of politics who had this kind of predisposition that gun bans do work, what they did was they went below this response, this obvious fast-thinking response that said that there's an increase in crime. They said, well, actually, let's have a little closer look. Had a closer look, stopped and thought, and went below the surface and actually found out what the real situation was. But it wasn't about the right not being as smart as the left or anything like that, of course, because what they did was, when they swapped the data over and the fast thinking made it seem like a gun ban actually led to a decrease in crime, of course you saw the opposite. That the people on the right-hand side who would say, well, that doesn't seem right, they would then look at the data closely, go below the surface of the data, and actually see what the data was telling them. And the people on the left fell for it. The people on the left were just as likely as the people on the right to fall for the fast thinking when the fast thinking agreed with the predisposition. So what I'm getting at is, even when we look at data, we think about data as being evidence. And when we look at data, what we see here is that we don't necessarily stop and think, that we don't engage our stop and think skills unless the data disagrees with our prejudgment. If we've got a prejudgment, if the prejudgment is, our kids are all doing well, and then we get some data and the data tells us that our kids are all doing well, then we'll stop and think. We won't necessarily stop and think and go below that. We'll just sit back and sit on that. We don't engage or stop and think. We have this fast thinking, emotional response, quick response, even to the data in this case. And one of the reasons for sharing that research with you is to say, first of all, about being strategic about the data. But even things like, when I hear people talk about being data-driven, it makes me shudder inside. What does data-driven mean? Data's almost worthless. It's almost useless without being converted into evidence, without that interpretation step, without that analysis. It doesn't have to be the kind of mathematical analysis, but that interpretation about what is this evidence, what is this data actually telling me? How do I convert this data into evidence to serve my need, to tell me what I need to know, whether it's challenging me or affirming me. And if it's affirming me, to push even harder behind it, because recognizing in myself that if once I get affirming evidence, maybe there's something else underneath it. Maybe I need to go below that. Because being data-driven is just being driven by the numbers. Being evidence-informed is about being informed by that data in a meaningful way, not responding to it in a fast way, but also taking into consideration those principles that we might have developed as reflective thinkers, responding to the overall direction that the system's moving in, and how we've decided that we're going to make that work for our partnership or our site. And so, for me, this research is pretty challenging. It's pretty challenging on two levels. One level, that only 40% of the population could actually get beyond the surface of the data. And then of that 40%, the ones who can get below the surface essentially choose not to or don't get below the surface when they get this kind of agreement with their prejudgment. And so the question that it raises for me is, What prejudgments have we got that influence our own decision making? When we see the data, when we see evidence that's presented to us, when we hear about the strategic intent and the direction in which the system's going, what prejudgments do we bring that stop us from doing that stop and think and getting below the surface level decision making? And how would you know? If these are prejudgments, if these are things that are already wrapped up in my identity, they're already wrapped up in the way that I think, how do I know that I've got them? It's a very difficult thing to surface and to get out there. But of course, we do that all the time. We do it all the time with the kids. We do it all the time with our teachers. You know, the idea of deprivatizing practice. Look, this is one of the things that deprivatizing practice does. By opening the door, what you're doing is you're getting other people to help you to challenge some of those preconceived ideas or those prejudgments that you have. That need not be in a negative way. You know, I've been involved in the Scientist in Residence program for the department last year, and we worked with teachers from across a range of schools a number of times over the whole year. And one of the things that we did within that was to put teachers who are experienced teachers, maybe expert teachers in teaching science at primary school and high school, and put them together with less experienced teachers and got them to partner up. And what we did was we used the experience and the expertise of the less experienced teacher to say to the more experienced teacher, I could see what you've done and I could try and replicate that in my classroom. But why did you do it like that? What was you thinking? What was going underneath? When you said that to that kid, I would have said something different. Why did you say that thing? Why did you ask that question in that way? Why did you do this? And so what they were doing was they were bringing out and bringing to the fore and making visible this preconception that was actually a really positive preconception, something that these expert teachers were doing all the time. It was just invisible to the less experienced teachers unless they were explicit about it. We see this ability to bring out the how you would know in things like the TEFL compass. And I think we also can start to see an answer to this question about how would you know when we think about diversity, when we think about the people that we surround ourselves with. And there's lots of research on this, and there's lots of questions, I think, about the value of diversity. What do we mean by valuing diversity? Where is the value of diversity in our teams and the people we surround ourselves with and the people that we choose to collaborate with? What do we mean by diversity? You know, do we mean cultural diversity? Do we mean intellectual diversity? What do we mean by diversity? There's lots of different ways of thinking about diversity. And just one idea that I wanted to share with you about those ideas about diversity. We'll often talk about in our teams the benefits of information diversity. You know, if we get a team together, and I'm thinking about the partnerships, of course, if we get a team together, we've got early years people, we've got primary people, we've got high school people, other people involved from the community and from the other services allied with education, then getting all those different voices in the room, we might think about that as being information diversity. But what we're starting to see more and more is that, yes, if you get different people in the room, you can get different information, you can get different perspectives, and you can certainly get more innovation. You know, the classic idea is that if you want to exploit a piece of information, then you get a group of people together who are very similar. But if you want to generate new information, if you want to find a new way forward, if you want to innovate, if you want to take a change in process and take that steps forward, if you want to adopt some of those new principles that you've developed or some of those principles, you know, for instance, like the principles in the Teaching for Effective Learning framework, if you want to develop those, then getting innovation, different people to be innovative, to generate what that means for you in your site, then getting different people involved can be really valuable. But, as it says here from this research that I'm quoting, the mere presence of diversity doesn't guarantee these benefits. It's like the autonomy and the empowerment. Just having the autonomy doesn't mean that you're going to get empowerment. Just having the diversity doesn't mean that you're going to get these benefits. It depends upon the nature of the relationship. It depends upon not that connectivity, but the connectedness. And so what we see from the research is that those social ties are important, that those shared values are important, that the shared intent is important, and of course that the shared ownership is important. I used to do some research with a group called the Institute for Innovation and Information Productivity. And those were technology companies like Microsoft and others, who had developed all these tools to make people more effective and more productive. And we're actually finding sometimes that those same tools were making their employees less productive. And so they built this system where projects would run around the world. And as daylight moved around the world, they'd get passed from America to Asia to Europe, and they'd move around the world. But what they found was that all the problems just got handed on. What was going on was everybody was doing stuff, and everybody was very busy doing stuff and doing the busy things and doing lots of tasks. But the tricky stuff, the strategic stuff, the difficult stuff, the really meaty stuff was getting handed from the Americas to Asia to Europe, and then it popped back to America the next day again, and then to Asia and Europe, and it was just going round and round and round. Because whilst people might have had those shared values and a shared intent, they didn't have a shared ownership. They weren't taking on, this is my job, this is what I need to do. And so the problems just got passed round and round and round. And when we do have these characteristics of the relationships in those diverse groups, what we see is that we generate this kind of in-group, this sense of being within the same group. It's not the in-crowd, it's not being popular, it's not being with your mates, it's not that in-crowd, but it's an in-group with these shared values and shared ownership and those sorts of things. And it can be changed. It can strategically be developed. It can strategically be shifted and shaped by the leaders within that group. I want to show you one example from some research that just came out last year. And what they did in this research was actually something pretty simple. They got people to watch videos of other people doing an action, doing a task. And the task was very simple. People were shown on a screen, it would say ready, and then after 1, 2, or 3 seconds, it'd say go. And when go came up on the screen, the participant would have to lean forward and press a button. And the participant was either in the blue team and had a blue sleeve on, or was in the red team and had a red sleeve on. And our people that we were scanning, whose brains were being scanned, were watching this, and watching somebody press a button would activate all these regions in the brain that you can see at the top there. So the right-hand side of the brain on the left, and the left-hand side of the brain on the right. But what they then did was they got people to watch a clip where people were told, ready, go, and then they had to press quickly. And they had somebody who was in the blue team and a clip of somebody in the red team doing the same action. And they told the observers that they were either in the red team or the blue team, and built up their identity of either being in the red team or the blue team. And what they found was, in response to this question, who was faster, if you were told that you were in the blue team and your identity as being within the blue team was developed, of course you would think that the blue team were going for the button faster than the red team. Even if it was exactly the same, what you find is that even if it was exactly the same speed, that the blue person was as fast as the red person, what you would find is that people who were observing would think that people in their team were faster than people in the other team. And you could see it happening in the brain. And what was going on in the brain was that you could see that when somebody felt like that they were in group with someone else, the regions of the brain that became active were the regions of the brain that were mimicking those actions of the person in their team. They wouldn't mimic those actions so heavily of the person who wasn't in their team, but in the brain, they would mimic the brain activity associated with doing that action only when it was somebody in their team. And so what we're starting to see is that this in-group membership, being within this group, shifts the way that we think about each other, and shifts our actions, shifts the way in which we interact, that connectedness between us. And when people are responding to an in-group member, they're much more likely to give them latitude, they're much more likely to go with them, they're much more willing to mimic them, as we saw in this research. They're more willing to give them the benefit of the doubt. and the more willing to value their input, the more willing to step back and see the bigger picture and sees how this person, who I think of as being an in-group member, somebody who I've got these shared values with, I'm much more likely to see how they fit with me, how they contribute to my thinking, how they contribute to this bigger picture and this shared understanding that we've got. If we come together as strangers and we don't have this in-groupness, we don't get as much of the latitude and this willingness and this benefit of the doubt and this valuing of input, and it stops us from being effective. It's not just about having diverse teams, it's about the way that we choose to construct whether or not we are an in-group group or if we're just a group of people who've come together who are all out-group members. And so for me, my kind of response is that, if we get this out-groupness, we end up here. We end up in this fast thinking, like I did with the guys in Bangkok. There's nothing that we've got in common. No, I can't see it. And I push them away. I don't draw them into my in-group. I don't see them as being, having these shared values and being someone. I don't give them the willingness and the latitude. I don't do that deep listening that Uncle Lewis was talking about. I do the surface listening. I listen to the content rather than what's underneath. It's only when I get beyond that fast thinking and into the in-group that I actually give them that latitude to share this space and be effective together. I'm going to just end by picking out on how this affects us as site leaders. Because as site leaders, there's a whole host of places where we need to be in an in-group to create an in-group around us. In fact, there's a whole host of places where we need to be an in-group champion. We need to shape and develop that group. And that might be with our teachers, our SSOs, our early childhood workers. It might be with our leadership team. It might be with our community. But I really want to focus on how, as a group of leaders, this matters. When we're thinking about our in-groupness, whatever it is that brings us together, it's got to be strategic. To be successful, all that research from the Zappia research showing us that it's the systems thinking that makes a difference to us as leaders. Whatever it is that's going to bind us together in this in-groupness, it's got to be strategically driven and not just action driven. And we've already got that. We've already seen that. This journey that we're going on is developing, and we're already taking on some of those strategic positions. We're working with all the schools in Port Augusta. And in Port Augusta, one of the things that they've chosen for the in-groupness to drive that is the development of these underpinning cognitive skills in their kids, these executive functions. I was saying hello to Ian Love from Lee Creek just before. Working with the Flinders cluster with the schools up there. And they've got this real focus on pedagogy. So they're taking that overall drive from the department and taking that on as a pedagogical focus, thinking about teaching for effective learning, thinking about how they're going to enact that through learning design and making sure that that's being developed and worked across their schools. The in-groupness has now got an identity. We've seen other places really taking on that interpretation of the Australian curriculum and not just seeing the curriculum as content, but seeing it through that pedagogical framework as well, through things like the general capabilities and the essence of the proficiencies and the concepts that I talked about before. The last things I wanted to say was, when you're doing your partnerships, find your in-groupness, recognize that it'll change over time, because the danger is that you'll fall into fast thinking. That when you find it, oh yes, we're doing this, and you'll fall into the pitfall to fall into is that we just do the same thing and we don't change it over time and we don't come back and revisit it. Of course, it's more likely to happen the second time that you do it. That in-groupness will develop over time. And when new people come into your group, come into your partnership, if you've got a really strong in-group culture, of course, they'll change, they'll shift into that culture. We know that the effect size of initial teacher education is so small because teachers' practice looks like the practice of the teachers around them, not the practice that they learnt at university or in their initial education, because of that in-group characteristic of the people that they work with. And use the system. Make the system work for you. You know, with your education directors, with the system, we're all pushing in the same direction. We're all pushing with this broad strategic intent. But you've got to take that level of autonomy and turn it into empowerment and use the system around you, use those support systems. And this will be a conversation that I know is going to carry on through the rest of today and tomorrow. What do you need? What support do you need to develop and then exploit your in-groupness? So my call to action for you across all this big idea about making connections and this shift in education is to use your partnerships and find your in-groupness. Find that strategic intent that you're going to work together around, that you can build shared values around. Because if you come at it from that, like we were doing in Bangkok, lots of different people coming together, yes, with some different perspectives, but that's really all we've got. There's very little value in that. Make these partnerships work for you and find your in-groupness.